Okay, now we're recording, so we'll have all of the good information to share. Thank you for joining us for New Hampshire UXPA this evening. This evening's talk will be from Stephen Genso, Head of UX at TMG, and he will be speaking about design tokens, become your developer's best friend. And I'm really excited to learn about this. Stephen was talking a little bit about what he's been learning along the way, and I think this is going to be some really fantastic information for a lot of us this evening. So without further ado, take it away, Stephen.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And great to see such a wonderful audience here from all over the country and around the world. Really appreciate the attendance and your time tonight. So hopefully you find this as interesting as we found learning about it and really diving into this pretty new technology opportunity in front of us. For a little background on where this came from, I've been working with TechMates Group for 5 years. We focus a lot with manufacturing partners, very large global multinational organizations. As such, a lot of our design challenges are big. We have big teams, we have lots of projects to support. We have many designers working alongside even more developers. And this came out of some opportunities that were put in front of us earlier last year, where we were trying to revisit how we coordinate between our design teams and our development teams for one of our projects specifically. And a couple people found out about, a couple blogs, a couple postings. It's still fairly new and not really a lot out there on this concept of design tokens. And this is not just a piece of technology, and it's not just a design tool. What this is a collaborative system between design and development. Part of it is thinking about how we name and structure our files. Part of it is making sure that we're communicating some of our unwritten design rules that are very helpful for our developers. And also part of it is just improving our ultimate output for our developers, being able to go farther than where we've already gone before. There's been a wonderful shift in the industry over the last decade with all of these new design tools. Personally, our organization heavily uses Figma, and we really love the collaborative aspect of it. We create our screens in one place, our business can review it in the same place, and our developers can inspect those files, view the CSS right there. And that's where we really want to, start to dive in more, and where design tokens will cover is going from that design into development. Because we've already got this tool in front of us that's packaging up all of our design decisions that we've made as CSS code. And yet still, even though we've done this, we do this handoff at this point, it's often pretty manual for our development team to come through and look at what is the color of this button? What is the radius of this border corner? Why can't we just give them that information we've already written? We've already programmed this into the file. And design tokens is a way that allows us to do that in a very readable method and a very extendable method. Without further ado, I'd like to give a big shout out to the team that really made this all possible, that we were researching with last year. We actually have Dana on the call here, our designer out in Ukraine, not on the call, but very, very valuable assets. We had two of our developers, Wampy and Nick, in Argentina and in Canada, respectively. And we even had a Scrum Master to help support us, keep things coordinated, track the work we were doing, and organize things. Pablo out in Argentina as well. So we kept on track even after all the celebrations with the World Cup, but it was a very great team, and none of this would have been possible without them. So again, some of the problems that we're facing. We're working with big teams on our projects. We need to keep our brands consistent across a lot of different platforms and a lot of different tools. We might be working on mobile applications and websites. We might be working on physical hardware devices. We might be working with kiosks or mobile apps instead of mobile websites. All of these need to have the same look and feel as we're working with them. And we need to be able to scale up to support all of them. Sometimes we might start when we're coming in with a design system that's focused around, a single feature, a single piece of an application. And as that application grows, as new features are added, as different teams come in to support it, we need to make sure that it stays consistent, it stays understandable, and it stays readable without just exponentially requiring the work that goes in to do anything with it and change anything with it. We also want to stay agile and as quick as we possibly can go in the design development handoff. Sometimes there are things that we're making in terms of the design and development interaction. You know, what we're creating doesn't necessarily need a large approval process or a large review process. We might have authority and autonomy as a design team to do things like, adjust border radiuses, adjust font sizes, things we can do to improve our styles that don't necessarily impact the branding review. You know, we're not changing a brand's primary color or font family, as they can be very, focused on making sure we're keeping the same things in place. But there are some things that we want to do fast and we want to be able to just move forward as we can. And finally, just trying to stay in communication with everything. You know, as we as a design team grow this library, make changes, make revisions, how are we telling our development teams about that? How are we making sure they know the extent of what changes? Because as soon as we change one thing in a core based library, now we need to be aware of everywhere that change needs to be replicated. And if there's a lot of development teams, there might or might not be a shared UI library. We might not have, something that's just going to immediately update, but we need a way to be able to communicate that quickly out to everybody as we go. This is where design tokens start to come into play. So a design token, as we call it here, is a small piece of code that represents a design decision. Usually we're going to see this when we're talking about our colors, our fonts, our spacing, and shadows was one that we found to be very powerful while we were working through this. And the idea of a design token is to extend out the concept of just a library. We want to take every design decision we've ever made, not only what our styles are and what our icons are, but where do we use certain colors? When do we use certain colors? Are some things only backgrounds? Are some things only font colors? Do we have a different version of this color that's accessible for color contrast, and we can only use that color for fonts? All of these little decisions that we make when we're building out a library and planning out our styles, we need to communicate that somehow. We need to track it. And the idea of design tokens gives us a way to track all of that information in the same way and by writing it out in the same kinds of decisions. This gives us something that is ultimately, one, consistent. We're trying to do this to put out just one source of everything we've ever needed to tell anybody about on how to implement our design library, whether it's a mobile app, whether it's a website, whether it's a phone kiosk, anything like that. We want one source of truth, just like we established with the standard design library. This also lets us make something scalable. What we'll go through as we dive into how we create these and how we write these is they reference each other. We go from the most general case to the most specific case. And the specific cases point back at the most relevant general case until we ultimately have one value at the very top that's referenced everywhere it's needed across an application. This also lets us be pretty flexible. We're trying to separate out what is a design decision versus what is put into the code. And when this structure is synchronized between design and development, if it's implemented in a way that can be automated, which it can be, we can ultimately start to take design decisions back into the designer's hands and not only take the mental load off our development to try and figure out where they need to make changes when design library styles update, but also take a lot of the development work off their plate as well. We were able, and unfortunately, when we continued exploring with it, I don't have it to show here, it's currently broken, but ultimately we were able to build an automated pipeline that allowed us to change a style in a Figma library, export that Figma library as a variable file, and automatically our development pipeline would see that new file was added to the folder. It would rebuild everything in the development project, and bang, the entire website would refresh 30 seconds later, 1 minute later, with brand new styles. black to white, white to black, green to red, whatever we needed to change was no longer a development issue. We could truly just redefine the style and update it everywhere it was needed. Which finally results in a really collaborative project. To get to that part, it forces us to be good communicative partners with our developers, making sure that we're being really clear on the intent behind everything we're doing. This can't happen from one team telling the other what to do. It has to be a strong joint effort between all the teams. So we're going to dive into what a design token is. And as Julia mentioned, we've got a pretty tight audience here. I want to make sure this is going to get a little dense, but I'm going to go as slow as possible, as quickly as I can. And conceptually, this all builds on each other. So if you want to pause, we can dive into any more topic. Feel free to use the raise hand feature. I don't think I can see the chat right now, but if you want to type a question in chat, Julia, feel free to read any of those out as well. What we want to dive into is, how do we stop thinking about a style guide and a style library and think about these as design tokens, as bits of design decisions, not just the style itself. So we start out with a style guide. You can create one if you're working on this project, but it can be done with an existing library. But ultimately, we want to start already having defined, what are our brand guidelines? What are the colors we're using? What are the typography styles we're using? What are our spacing values? How are our shadows, colored and positioned? Have all of those root brand elements done. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take everything we have there, and just as when we're building out a project, we start to use them in consistent ways, we're going to document how we want to use them and how they should be used for every scenario we can think of going forward. So for a typical style guide, we're going to have a lot of these things defined, ready to go. So things like our colors are already broken out. We have our font families and sizes. We have some pretty fixed spacing units we're going to use over and over. And all of these will become tokens. And all of these will encode not just what the style is, but where it's used and when it's used. If we look at just one color, we'll look at a simple example of how this goes from a design decision into an actual development line. So in our case, we have design in our brand guideline. This is the hex value for a primary color. Now, a style guide will likely have this displayed much nicer than this, but ultimately, this is the data. This is what we're telling a business reviewer or a developer when they look at this style. We're saying this is a color. This is the core attribute. Everything in this section is going to be a color. This specific color is a primary color. And that primary color has this hex value. 3 simple pieces. Now, a developer would likely look at this and say, great, I need to use this. I want to use this to color out what our header background looks like. We're going to use our primary background based on this design. I can see here, we've got the primary background. That hex code is in my design here. I've done my inspector. So I know, boom, copy that hex code right in. That gets cumbersome because now every time we have to use that color, we're going to be just inspecting, seeing the hex code, copying that in. So just like in our design library, we create styles, we create variables, we create reusable components that allow us to save time and effort and allow us to take one piece and use it in multiple places while referencing just that original source. Same thing in development. We're going to create a variable. This is our primary color variable. Here's the hex code. Anywhere I see that I want to use a primary color, I'm going to drop that in. However, typically that would then be done. The developer is going to look through and inspect and see, okay, here's that hex code. Now I know I need to use that specific variable. Excuse me. So it's the same concept of what we're doing when we're creating our components and our variables within Figma but done on the development side. So we want to expand out how we think about our design variables and how we can work within the same method. If we're already going to be creating in Figma, for example, our shared library, our basic components, and we're going to be setting different examples and different patterns up as we build this out. We're going to decide, here's all of our colors available. Our buttons will use these specific colors. Our inputs for borders will use these specific colors. Our fonts will use these specific colors. We break that out in a way that is very usable on the design side, but not always communicated that it's a pattern on the development side. From the development perspective, they're just seeing a list of styles that are being used without any really background context. The developer would need to go and reference the actual style library and then knowledgeably compare that to what they're looking at the design file and try to build those same connections and patterns themselves. Why don't we just tell them what we're doing, what that system is, and how we're trying to use these styles in very consistent, repeatable ways? So let's look at how we want to use one of our brand colors in a typical library. We have a lovely forest green color here, and we want to use this for a couple different things. We know that for our theme that we're working with here, this green is going to be used for some backgrounds, it'll be used for some borders, and it'll even be a font color here or there. Well, we can get a little more specific than that beyond just what we're going to use it for in a theme. And as we're creating our components, we'll make those decisions. We'll say, this is specifically the background color for our primary buttons and for our banners. For our borders, we're only going to use this for user inputs. We're going to use this on, let's say we've decided we're doing inline validation, and we're going to have a nice green border here when the user types something and it checks out, validates okay. We're going to use that same color for the font for user feedback underneath that validated input. And we'll use it for titles, across our application, have a nice branded primary color title. Great. All of that we've done kind of in our head as we're building things out. But the developer is missing those connections. They don't necessarily know that we've decided this is the specific color we're using for backgrounds in this theme when we need the color green. What we tell them is, here's our brand styles. So here's this green color. And then go look through in this design and you see that green color. Okay, it's here for the buttons. It's here for the banner backgrounds. It's here for the user feedback. But we don't show them the map of how we got there. We don't really make it clear that all of these are meant to be consistent with each other. And they're meant to stay linked and stay connected, no matter what that green color is. And if we wanted to say, for example, change that forest green to a lime green, nothing else beyond that should change except for what the color is. If we're now just changing out what that green value is, well, we just simply switch that out in our Figma theme, which then causes everything to switch right out in our connected components at the UI level. All of those connections we know about. We've decided that they should be linked together that way, and they should be consistently represented that way. If we can communicate this to a development team, that allows us to really expand out what we do in terms of a variable. Because for our development team, they have a much more powerful use of variables than we can typically use in a design tool. And I suspect this will change within the next couple of years as this becomes popular. But in a development environment, unlike most design environments, a value of a variable can be another variable. We don't have to give it a hex code. We can just tell it, look at what this other variable is and put in that value. And it doesn't matter how many connections there are, which means it doesn't matter what all of those middle links are. We only need to know the end result where we use it, and that will go back and find whatever we've defined as the color for its parents, 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 parent, however many levels are needed. Typically, just the 3 levels you see here are all we need. So I'm going to pause here. Any questions about that conceptually before we look into, how we kind of write this information out, how we structure these kinds of names? All right. So, great. We're thinking about, how do we convey this kind of connection? How do we convey the pattern of where we use this style and when we use this style, and not just what the style is? So when we looked at that brief code example, we had a variable named primary color, which, great, it's readable, it's legible, but it doesn't leave us a lot of room. It's either a primary color or it's not. So we want to create a system of names that's readable, that's still human understandable, but also really enables that deep development connection. So when we look at this as the concept, how do we have these links represented? We have our forest green, we have our borders, we have our inputs. How do we say that? How do we write that out? And when we finish a library, it might always look up something like this, where we have, you can see here, all of these start with the same word, color. We create a naming system that goes from the most generic shared property to the most specific property. And that property is different based on what the token is for. And that's where we see here, there's 3 different columns. You'll notice our first tier is our brand style. It's color, brand, forest green. We almost read it backwards to make it more understandable for a human. This is the forest green brand color. Our second tier is one that may or may not exist depending on the size of your project. We recommend it because it can help keep things structured and it keeps things very scalable going forward. But the idea of a theme, what is a selection of these brand colors that we're using? Very common might be a dark and a light, where we say, okay, if we have several shades of green, well, our dark mode background is going to be a dark color of that green, and our light mode background is going to be a light color of that green. So a tier 2 might say, in this case, there's only one theme. We call it color core for core theme. Just something we found as a handy name rather than main, which has a lot of connotations within development. And then what it is, it's the green border. It might be color dark border green or color light border green. Just some designation of this is a set of brand colors that's going to be used in a specific way. And then finally, tier 3, which is what we're usually commonly familiar with and what we're usually sharing with our development team, that's just that UI style right there. This is the color of a user inputs border in the success state. So it's a lot of information to break down in a couple short keywords. So we come up with a system of how we write these out. So they're going to be repeatable, they're going to be understandable, and everybody knows how they need to be created and set up when we're building out our library. Again, very important, this is done in collaboration with design and development. It's going to be a lot harder to adopt if any one group is telling the other groups how to name their systems, how to set everything up. And honestly, the process of coming up with a naming system and structure really just breaks down a lot of assumptions between the 2 teams. It's a very valuable exercise between both of the groups in understanding where we're coming from and what we need to really do to support each other to get things built out. So the naming structure that we found most helpful has 4 parts: namespace, tier, token, and variant. Namespace was omitted from all of the previous examples because it's not something you're usually going to write yourself. I mentioned previously, the whole goal of this system is to be unbound from any specific tool. My examples here all reference Figma. They reference a specific plugin that I'll show you in a little bit what the name of that is that we use that's open source. There's other plugins out there that are already doing this on their own. There are paid tools out there. This can work with any design tool. This can be input and intaken into any development framework. So the namespace helps us track that. In our case, we just automated this. It was very handy. We were able to just have it when our development team took in the file, they could tell where it came from, and we just prefix it with a shortcut, shorthand name on where did this data come from. So in our case, almost everything was prefixed with FG for Figma. Another example would just be prefixed with XD for Adobe, but typically you wouldn't see this in the development tool. It would be something that you're structuring and preparing for your developer later. Tier is where we start to actually come into the design decisions that we're making and communicating how these are used and where they are used. So in our case, again, we recommend a 3-tier structure, even if we're not using multiple themes, because it gives us more room to extend this out into the future. We started out with a 2-tier structure, and as soon as we wanted to start exploring with using a dark mode and a light mode, we had to go back and rewrite all of our tier 3 tokens now because they were not built to support, different themes. So it can be helpful. It might really not be necessary if you have a very small contained project. But again, we were doing this to scale up to a large organization. So definitely recommended that if it's going to be something more than just a handful of people working on this for a long time. So our first tier, as we saw, that's things like our forest green, our lime green, our royal purple. What are those global style properties? These are things that are just going to be the root value. These are the tokens that are going to have that hex code assigned to them. This is going to be a token that has a font, like weight assigned to it, or a pixel value. Anything that has that actual root piece of brand data, it's a tier 1 token. Tier 2, again, just grouping those into subsets. Theme is the best way to think of it. Out of all of our different possible options, what are the ones we're going to be using for this group? Again, on a smaller project, might be everything. It might be just almost a complete overlap between your tier 1 and your tier 2. So again, this is meant to be flexible. It's meant to be a shared communication exercise. Our tier 3 tokens are our ultimate UI elements. So this is, how is that directly applied? When we have a primary button, what background color are we using? What border are we using? What font size should we use for our body? What type of heading should we use? All of this is going to be what's ultimately put into the development environment to reference, this is how that design decision should be used. And then finally, the token invariant is just describing what we're looking at. So in our case, if we have, our color brand, well, it's forest green. Or if we have our color of primary buttons, well, there it is. It's primary buttons versus secondary buttons, or it's inputs versus success state inputs versus invalid inputs. What is that exact spot on the user interface that this is going to be applied to? So if we put all of those different rules together, let's take a look back at the examples that we just had before we broke down the name. So our first base level tier 1 token, we have our namespace. This came from Figma for this specific token. The tier, this is a brand color, tier 1. And the token invariant, the name of the color itself, forest green. Our tier 2 token, the theme that uses this color. Well, this is a color from our core theme. This is a border color, and this is for green borders, the variant of border there. And then finally, where do we use this? This is used for input colors, and it's used for borders and a success state. So each one of these different tiers writes the name the same way and communicates different information in the same way. And the real power of it comes when we truly connect them up. Because in our development environment, now we have 3 variables that have one shared value. Our forest green variable has that actual hex code attached to it. When our developer is setting up the project and is building this tool out, is getting everything ready, they're going to say, okay, here's the colors I'm going to need for all of my borders. And those I'm just going to say, point to, forest green. I know from the token that I have in front of me, I should just reference whatever that forest green value is when I need a green border. And then when I'm actually building out my web page and I'm actually setting up the CSS for that button, well, all I have to say is, if I need to style this input and I need to make that border green, just point to the thing that says green border in tier 2. And I don't care what hex value that tier 2 style token has. It could be anything I want. It could be orange. It will always be what I need it to be, as long as the design team keeps that reference at tier 1 the same. As long as I know that that points to forest green, I don't have to worry about what the hex value is. I don't have to worry about making a typo. I don't have to go through and find every single place that a green border is used in my code when the style guide changes. All I have to do is just know that I'm going to get that new file of those design tokens, and all of those tier 1 values will change, but everything in tiers 2 and 3 is just pointing back upwards, and I don't have to change anything downstream. So I have a couple examples to show from the library build. Again, want to pause here, good spot. Any questions on how we're thinking about that, how we're breaking that down and writing that out?
I do have a quick question. I guess
Please.
instead of chatting, I can talk it verbally here.
Yeah, please.
So basically, it's almost the converse of what you just described. If I'm using a specific shade of gray for both the shadow, as an example, and also a base fill of a disabled button, let's say, and then I want to change the hex value, and now the shadow is too dark, but I still want to retain the same base fill, do you have to just create a new token so the button now points to that?
Exactly.
So how do you control the very first tier?
Yeah, so in that case, likely what you would wind up doing is creating either a new reference for a primary value of, this is a specific shade of gray that's only going to be used in these areas, or maybe you're updating it at tier 2 of, okay, well, my border values pointed to, dark gray, and my shadow values pointed to the tier 1 dark gray. But maybe I want those shadow values, I've changed that dark gray hex value. It's too dark for the shadows. Let's have the shadows now point to light gray. And now they're referencing a different hex value in that tier 1. So you can change where those connections are made. And oftentimes you wind up having to create a lot of new tier 1 and tier 2 styles to make sure you're supporting all of those different end cases farther in the application.
Okay.
And that's where, that's where, as I jump into practice, unfortunately, as our designers, we have a little bit more legwork than our developers to make this work. As I mentioned briefly, our design tools, at least this might be changing, this might have changed since I've last looked into this. I'm guessing this will change quickly. We don't always have the ability to do that kind of variable points to a variable that is a completely native part of development. So we have to do a bit more of the manual work, but there are some tools and tricks we can use that make it easier when we're exporting. And ultimately, we found it's a lot less time for the designer maintaining the library to do that little bit of extra manual work, because it's always library-based work. Once it's done, it's good to go. And we don't need to be changing it every time we're creating a design as well, because we do get to inherit that parent library. So really quick, just to share, specifically, we use a Figma plugin called Design Tokens. We chose this one simply because it was open source. There's a couple other ones out there that are very powerful, look a little easier to use, but are some paid solutions. Again, we just picked this one simply because it was free and open source, meaning we could extend it and modify it if we needed to. From what we found for our purposes, we really didn't. Once we understood how the plugin itself was working and some of the kind of nuances around it, especially as we understood what it paired with, which is Style Dictionary, we were able to get pretty much everything we wanted done out of it without needing to really do a lot of modifications. And Style Dictionary is what you're going to want to tell all of your developer friends about. This is the magic that makes it happen. This is a free tool that was put out by Amazon, and this is what takes essentially what you're spitting out from your design tool and turns it into those named coded variables. So very, very, very powerful combo together. So as I mentioned, when we're looking at our Figma styles, I want to give another quick shout out to Data, one of the designers who made this all happen on research. All of her awesome artwork you'll see in this section was created for our demo project, which was Cream Colors, a fictional ice cream company. So just to show a couple contexts of like what we built out for our library and how these really came together in practice. Again, we're not as lucky as a developer where we don't have a lot of the references. So in our case, conceptually, all of these different tiers inherit each other. We still have to create them manually. We still have to put in the hex codes to use them at every tier versus just saying, go look at the other one. So in our case, when we did make a change for a tier 1 token, we needed to manually update tier 2 and 3 to keep our design files and our design process working correctly. But in this open source plugin, there is a workaround to keep that inheritance working for your developers. So again, you get to be the martyr here. You get to make yourself look out and like, oh, I'll take that on. I'll do that for you. And it's going to be so easy for you to use down the road. They'll love you for it. So some examples of tier 1 tokens, in context, we came up with, we wanted just a big palette of colors. It's a very bright, vibrant website, a lot of, different ice cream flavors and colors and everything all over. That was the core of the project there. So we started with a color grid. And we also found what we wanted to do was have very specific color representations for the flavors themselves. We based all our flavors around colors and wound up creating very large sets of color that are tier 1 references. So these were used, both of them, within the same theme, but we're able to give a lot of context around, hey, these are like the brand colors, these are more generic versus, this color is only a border color for this flavor of ice cream. We can get nice and detailed with it, even at the brand level, just in terms of what we're naming it and describing how it should be used and where it should be used. When we look at the tier 2, we can already see, this is where we're really just taking that subset. We've got this big swath of colors that's available for us to use. Which ones are we using? How are we using them? Again, depending on your project, depending on your style guide, if you only have one style or one theme, there might be a big overlap between, it might be essentially a circle of what are your brand styles and what are your theme styles. In our case, again, we were doing this as a research project. We gave ourselves a lot to draw from and pull from, but you can see here, we're filing down already. Out of all of those colors we have, which ones are used for backgrounds? Which ones are used for borders? Which ones are used for text? And just to throw an example here, again, unfortunately in Figma, we're doing this a bit manually. So you can see there, these are all just sort of living next to each other in terms of the style palette, in the library of what we're using and what we see there. So it does require us to kind of set all those up side by side. But again, we found it's really the most effort was just around creating this and building this out. And once it's built, it's just used like any other library. Again, just showing the quick subset of couple colors are backgrounds, couple colors are borders. And finally, those tier 3 tokens, again, even more specific. We're saying these are only the colors used for primary buttons and in every specific state. We have a couple options for backgrounds of the default. We have one option when it's disabled, just really prescripting down, just like we would when we're creating these components, we're creating these styles, how are these used? Whereas, we might, when we're creating in the design library, just build this into the component. We might not build this out into actual style references. We might just have our nice library of inspect the buttons, see the color, see the label. If we take the time to build these out as component styles, in our tool, this is how we can just export that data and just absolutely tell, this is where it's used, this is how it's used. And this is where we just get more and more minute on what we're using this color for, how we're using it, where it should be placed. Julia, go ahead.
Wendy had a good question in the chat. How do we keep track of versions of the token changes? And how do we communicate the versions in the naming convention?
Great question. So in our case, there really wasn't versioning. So this would be a little bit different because we were testing a lot of the automation. What the easiest way we thought of to do that was without testing it is really all of this depends on the export. So this doesn't happen automatically until you give that new file definition to either a developer to manually intake it and rebuild it, or to the automated process to rebuild it. So I don't have an answer for you in terms of naming and tracking the naming within a token itself. Other than that, I don't think you would want to put a version in the token because the token should be a universal reference. The easiest way to version out, what we're building and when we're making those updates would just be, don't export these variables every time anything little change. Like, let's make sure we're ready to go and batch it out. Because we want those changes to be invisible as far as the development team is concerned. They shouldn't have to worry about whether it's version 1 or version 2 of the file they're coming in, because then they would have to go through and update, their core references for that tier 2 token or something like that. They'd have to go and change what is this version theme name, versus it's all just sitting and waiting, and it updates only when we actually export and tell it to process the new styles. And now none of our names change, but all of those parent tier 1 values are now updated and corrected. And that's when our change would happen. So it's more of a manual control in terms of it doesn't update until we tell it to. But once we do, it can be completely automatic from there. I hope that helped.
Yes, sounds like it.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, awesome. Yeah, sorry, I can't see the chat window right now. So the little shortcut we have, and this is not going to be universal, but this is really, again, how do we bridge those gaps? How do we enable this? A powerful feature we had in the specific plugin we used was being able to export those references, even though we can't use them ourselves. So to show an example here, when we're actually creating this style in Figma, what we could do with a feature with this plugin was add a reference link inside the description of this color style. And what we have here is, yes, we've manually created, this is our brand white color, and this is a white color in our core background styles. But when we export this tier 2 token, it won't have that hex code attached to both of those variables. It will do the development method for us and say the brand variable has a hex code as the value. The white background core color, the value is just brand.white. Just go look at that one. And that's JSON notation. That is the data structure of what is ultimately exported from the design file. But that should all work out of the box right there. We had to play around with it a little bit to make sure we were using the notation correctly when it was being intaken, but it set up all of the inheritance for us, which was really powerful. So again, our development team didn't have to go through and build all of those links in themselves. We could do it for them as a design team. So they could just start using these right away as soon as they were ready to go. Just a few quick slides. I'm not going to dive into the technical side of this. There's not enough time, and also I'm not qualified enough to really give a good breakdown on how to actually implement this. But really the main thing to know as the design team is this is just you helping communicate what our intent is and what the decisions are. You know, a lot of this comes down to just we're doing the same things we've done. We're adding a little more overhead into how we're building and structuring our library file itself. But in doing so, we're saving mountains of time for our development team after that. We're doing this in a way that is easily intaken by them, fits into their natural process, fits into how development should be performed and how it can be kept clean and scalable and maintainable. So in our case, again, this is a pretty framework agnostic solution. This was meant to be universal and generic. We really built this whole process as a separate little application that could bolt onto, any one of our partners and client teams. It's almost a separate little mini application that all it does is take in a file, export it from Figma, and then build it into these tokens and then send it off wherever we need it to go. And in our case, that was just a simple ice cream website, but it could be anywhere. So in our case here, showing on the right, this is an example of what is actually output from Figma. So you can see here where we had our naming structure and pattern, every one of those indents is one of those dashes. This is ultimately how it's read by the machine and translated into a data file. Everything is broken out into just groups of groups of groups of groups. So from here, we just send that raw data file right out of our application. It was so easy, they even taught me how to send it up to a remote server. It was very simple, just a simple authentication. But we had this whole thing automated. And all I had to do is when we had our new library version ready to go, I just hit export to URL. I confirmed that I've got all the properties that I wanted selected to export, and away it goes. It goes to a remote server, in our case in GitHub. GitHub just automatically sees, hey, somebody sent me a file. It runs that Amazon style dictionary. Our programmers set all of that up to basically know, okay, if I get a data file that looks like this, here's how I build variable names out of that JSON file. And that's it, it's done. It automatically builds it out, it converts it out, ready to go. And now the tokens can be either used locally if you're doing testing, they can be sent, in our case, out to the actual production build, which kicked off another automation and brought them in. But it's all meant to just be getting data where it needs to be in any form we can use it. And in this case, taking all of those conceptual decisions that we make, that we know when we're building out patterns, when we're structuring a library, there are so many unspoken decisions and rules we create for ourselves to make these consistent, cohesive, beautiful patterns for our styles, to have something that is unique, but repeatable, but understandable. We can communicate all of that out in a way that doesn't require lengthy meetings, that doesn't require a developer to understand the design process and what goes into making a good design system. That's just simply translated down into, here's where you use it. And with that, I would love to see everybody take this and go forth and create with it. Again, this is a pretty new concept. There wasn't a lot out there when we started working on this, more things that are in the sense of the early draft of the internet, vague but exciting. It's really powerful, and it really depends on who you're using it with and what you want to do with it. But as a concept of how we think about our own design process, how we can be good partners for our development team, there's so much just power here in what we can do with it and where we can go with it. And with that, I want to end with just, again, thank you all very much for your time. I want to now open up the floor completely for any other questions. But this was really great to get to share this with you all.
That was great. Thank you so much, Steve. And I get it. So it worked, at least part of it. So great job. There's some really good questions in the chat. I think Juan had the first one. I'll read it, and then Juan, if you want to come off mute to chat or whatever works best for you. Could you talk more about the design effort you mentioned we designers have to do when naming tokens? How is it documented? How does the source of truth you mentioned at the beginning look like?
That's a great question. So all of this, ultimately, the source of truth was not a separate document. Really, we came to this naming convention and it's documented in how we build out our Figma file and how we build out those names. So an example here, you can see, you can trace through the decisions we made and how we name things, because it comes out as a raw data file. JSON is the type of data that it is. So we communicate with our development team to really come up with what should this be? Because just as we are prescribing to it by creating our actual variables in Figma, someone needs to create within that style dictionary tool the translator. Think of it like building a Rosetta Stone together, where we have it represented one way in Figma. Based on how we represented it, exports as a very generic bucket of folders. You know, we have our color folder that has our brand colors, our flavor colors, and our main colors. Within our main colors are our background colors. Within our background colors are light blue and pink. Within pink comes the actual data. What is the description of this? What type of data is this? What is the value of this? All of this is just wrapped up automatically out of Figma and bundled together in just a single data file that's then translated through the style library for the style dictionary tool, excuse me. So likely what you would want is some kind of shared documentation for this. Some tools that we've seen that are starting to do this are like Storybook has done this in the past, and it looks like they're expanding out to support this kind of naming structure. You know, right now, again, there's not really like a clear, easy point. You're like, yeah, just go use this, it'll do it for you. Likely just documenting that as a shared reference between design and development will be helpful, but ultimately it'll come out through the library once it's used, because once we have it there, we're using it, we're maintaining it and extending it. All of the patterns are already built into the variables themselves and built into the translation and style dictionary itself. So we don't necessarily have to write somewhere what every single one is. Once we're agreed on that structure and pattern, now it's just reinforced through use.
I have a couple of questions related to what you're just speaking of. So I noticed that you're using hyphens rather than underscores in the token naming. Is that best practice, or is that required by the code base to have hyphens?
Hyphens we found just were helpful in terms of representation, because ultimately we weren't writing these out as hyphens. You know, in Figma we're using slashes because slashes are our folders in Figma. So it's a little bit of it doesn't necessarily matter. And again, that's where it's a little bit of an art form between the two groups. Is, you know, in Figma we're using slashes. In JSON it's dot notation, and then ultimately the end variable again might be a hyphen or an underline. So I likely misrepresented that here. I believe my first variable example that I actually took from a smart programmer using an underscore, and all of mine used hyphens. That's just the designer coming out there.
Okay, all right.
Great question. Yeah.
So the second question would be, as far as transparent colors, let's say I had a white that needs to be 50% transparent. Do you define a new value, or do they do it in CSS and say, hey, let me show 50% only?
That's a great question. So we didn't really play around with that too much because we were a bit limited in that I don't believe we could export alpha values. So we couldn't really do too much with transparency. I'm not actually, you know, that's a great question on whether that would be a new tier 1 value, or would it be at the tier 3 in terms of it's like a half shade. I think that would come down to communication. You know, how do you want to represent this? Because ultimately, is it a root parent color that's referenced in multiple places? You know, are multiple things transparent? And now that can all point to the same transparent, or is there some way to trace that back out through and say, from this parent color, these tier 3 colors are, you know, semi-visible? My instinct hearing that would say, keep it tier 1, because what if you want to change that transparency value later?
Yeah, so the case of shadows, it would be a percentage of a gray. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, actually, that's a great point, because shadows, we found that's not one that we went into it, you know, expecting to use. We're like, okay, color, yeah, obviously. Font, great. Size, let's try that. Shadows wound up being really powerful alongside font because of what we could do on the development side with Style Dictionary. Where previously, when a developer is like inspecting a shadow, they're looking at it, they're trying to copy out what is all of the CSS, what is the radius, what is the positioning, what is the blur, what is the color, what is the transparency. If we put all of that into a design token in the file and exported it, it could be turned into a single variable for development. Same with fonts too, which was very powerful. Rather than having to copy, okay, here is the font size variable, and here's the font family variable, and here's the font weight variable, we bundled all that together into a single font variable that they could reference when they were using it.
So in that regard, if they're using a font for a headline, let's say it's 72 points versus body copy, those would be distinct tokens, little packages, I guess, with all the variables within each token.
Exactly. Yeah, you would have all of that at the tier 1 level, defining, what are our core styles that we're using, and then when they get to the tier 3, they're not referencing like multiple tier, like a different tier 1 for the weight and one for the color and one for the font family. They just grab like a single, like brand desktop body or something like that. And that's every font property they're going to need for anywhere body copy is used in a tier 3 token.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Those are some great questions. So you just mentioned that shadows seemed maybe surprisingly useful. Was there anything else that, as part of this learning process, that caught you by surprise or that you thought might pan out more than it did? Or...
Yeah, so I think the other one that I had just mentioned, the mix-ins, was very powerful because that saved, again, even more time on the development side. Was the idea of not only are we already representing all of these decisions, but now we can even do some of the legwork and kind of combine them into easier to use references and packages. So that was a big help for the developers when they were doing font styles and settings there. That and shadows were probably the big surprise. Where we really started to be surprised on the negative side with the limitations were around what we can do within Figma to link these variables and reference them. I expect as this becomes, more widely used and more popular, I hope we see some of that functionality directly integrated into a design tool. The ability to say this style just references some other style. So I can name it 2 different things and have it kind of more specific versions of it, but only have to change it in one place rather than have to change it everywhere. It's not a ton, but it does require some legwork, and especially when we were testing it and prepping it with the demo, we found areas where I might update all of the styles in the library, but forget to change that reference line. And we're like, why are none of the colors changing? Well, because I changed the hex codes in Figma. And so all of that Figma library inherits and updates and everything looks like it's changed, but it's actually still pointing to the old color reference. So I have to kind of remember, like, oh, I got to change it in both places for each tier that I'm changing.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a little bit of a hurdle to get over. Once we got in the habit, it's not bad, and it wasn't, again, a lot of additional legwork because it's just changing like 2 lines of text. It's pretty small. It's just you got to remember to do it.
So that's the real secret to closing the loop on becoming the developer's best friend, getting those last little bits all in line. How did the developers feel at the end? Do you see this type of process really, it sounds like it, but contributing to happiness on both sides of projects going forward once things settle down?
Yeah, it takes out a lot of the manual work on the developer side of having to go through and inspect what we're doing. It becomes a lot faster because now, we're making such powerful use out of the names and everything like that. In Figma, we create these 3 tiers of token and we build our components using those tier 3 tokens. So when the developer is inspecting the design, they see the name of the tier 3 variable and they can just copy that name and just use that and not have to think about what it is, make sure they got the right value, and they're just using the same exact variable names that they're seeing within the design file. So it's just much simpler. You know, it's like, oh, was this the right shade or was it that shade? You know, is this used everywhere? It's just written out for them. It's just, you know, hey, this is this is input border green. Perfect, done. That's what I'm looking at.
That sounds fantastic. This is really exciting. Just checking if anyone has any last questions or comments, or Stephen, if you have any parting thoughts to share with everyone as they go forward.
I do have one last question actually for Stephen. So you mentioned, yeah, the libraries and I didn't scrutinize the diagram that carefully. It was kind of hard to see, some of it was a little small. But are you truly creating a token library in Figma that in turn gets published and feeds into your core library of foundations? Or are you doing the JSON connection directly to your foundational library and not having a dedicated Figma file that has the tokens?
So in our case, all of this was built out of just our standard Figma design library, which was even more helpful for us. So it was business as usual. We had a single Figma component library that is built that we can export the data out of. So it's standard, you know, shared library. It's all there. Everything in Figma is drawing from it. There's not two Figma libraries. It's really just kind of supercharging how it's built and encoding all of this data into the styles that are right in the library. So we can export all of that metadata into a file, and that file is then just sent off to whatever the development process is to intake that.
Okay.
I just dropped your LinkedIn information into the chat, Stephen, so you might make some new friends.
Awesome. I'd love to. Actually, if I can find the link here, I can share the final site. Unfortunately, again, it's not quite wired up right now for me to show it updating, but I would like to show all of the awesome work that was done by the team using all of these beautiful colors and our very friendly Scoops the Ghost. I love the ice cream roulette most of all. Yeah, lots of use of color all across the site. So it was a very, very good learning experience there.
Oh, it's beautiful.
It's nice to work with something that has more than like two primary colors for the brand style.
Pretty exciting. But I'm picturing like changing one part of that. There's a lot to track down. So this is
exactly
super helpful to illustrate the value.
Yeah. So in this case too, you know, when we had it set up and configured, and again, we broke it when we started trying to introduce light and dark modes and really extend this out. But essentially in Figma, when we had this, I could change the reference for the white background to the black background and vice versa. And immediately now we have dark mode, you know, without having to do a line of development. All of the references are just saying, hey, you know, give me whatever my core font color is and my core background color is. And well, now those background colors are just pointing to the opposite color. You know, I don't care as terms of a variable is, and it just displays whatever it was given.
That's so cool. I love it.
Awesome. Any final thoughts from anybody? All right. Well, thank you so much again for your time, everybody. It was really exciting to share this with you all, and glad you were able to learn something.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and you're getting lots of love in the chat. And I think everyone's really excited to start learning even more.
Yeah, please. Any other questions you have, you know, here's my email here as well. Reach out on LinkedIn or anything. But yeah, happy to try and share what we've done here. So again, I mean, even just a couple months ago, there's not a ton out there on, you know, how to use this and what to do. So a lot of really great work from a lot of really great people to help pull this together and figure it out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for learning everything, for sharing everything you've learned with us. And looking forward to seeing what the next steps are for everyone. So we plan to meet next month for our April meeting. When we have the information available, we'll share it in the Slack channel and then out and about on all of our socials that Cal has shared. And I hope to see many of you back with us at that point. And thank you again, Stephen, for joining us and sharing all the ice cream and all the details and, you know, going through this so we can all learn from the process. This was really exciting to see. We appreciate your time. All right, thank you everyone for joining us, and I can't wait to see you next month. Have a good evening.
Have a good night, y'all.